and we're going to really dive a bit deeper into this whole question of how do we share our faith? How do we evangelize those who are apathetic and disinterested? And to give you a flavor of the kind of person I mean, one of my oldest friends is a guy called John. I realized that there was a John in my previous example. These are not the same John, and not all of my friends are called John. But one of my oldest friends, his name is John. And when I first met him, something like 27, 28 years ago, John told me his story. I found out his story. He had grown up in a Christian home. He had walked away from his faith as a teenager. And by the time I met him, he was about 21, 22. He didn't know what he believed. And more interestingly, he didn't care that he didn't know what he believed. And during one of our early conversations, when I tried to bring up faith, I remember him saying to me these words, or very similar words to this. He said, Andy, I don't care. I don't really care about God. I don't care about God. And as I pressed back slightly, because I was in my early 20s, so pretty enthusiastic, so I think I sort of said, what do you mean you don't care? How can you not care about God? It's the most important thing ever. Come on, man. And John looked at me and said, well, I don't see what the fuss is about. I don't need God. He said, I've got my life's happy. I've got the job I want, the flat I want, the car I want, the woman I want. He said, why do I need God? I just don't care. And back then, I think I really struggled, actually, to then take that conversation any further. And I have plenty of other friends, I think, like him, actually, today. People who are not, they don't object. They don't come up, they wouldn't say to me, oh, Andy, you're wrong. Let me tell you why you're wrong. There is no God. They would simply say, I don't care. And surveys have shown that the number of people who don't care about faith is growing across Europe. We had our latest census here in the UK in 2021, and 25% of people in the UK, 25% of British people say they are not into religion. They're not interested in spirituality. They don't have any religion. They're not atheists, not identifying as that. They just don't believe anything. And I suspect on this call, many of you will have friends, family, neighbors, colleagues like this. They're not hostile. They literally don't care. They are apathetic. They are disinterested. And the challenge is sometimes in Christian apologetics, that word I used earlier, we kind of can end up assuming, well, our friends have got arguments against Christianity. They're actively hostile. And when they're not hostile, a lot of our apologetics falls flat, really, because our friends go, well, I don't care about your arguments. I just don't care if there's a God. So how do we reach people like that? That's what I'm going to think about over the next 20 minutes or so. And obviously, just to recap, we learned the 3 questions in the previous session, didn't we? We learned the what do you mean by that question, where you pick up on words. So someone says there's no evidence that God exists. You might say, what do you mean by evidence, for example? We looked at the why do you think that question. So someone says, I don't know, I think religion is the cause of all the wars in the world. And you can gently say, that's a very interesting viewpoint. And, what led you to think that? And then thirdly, we asked the wondering question. And we gave the example of human rights and asking that question about, have you ever wondered why we care passionately about justice, for example? And I want to suggest to you this in this second talk, that third question, the wondering question, is the go-to question if we want to start conversations with friends, neighbors, colleagues, family members who are disinterested, apathetic, agnostic, and so on. And to give us a bit of an insight into why it can be helpful, I'm going to take a little look at a dialogue that happened a few years ago on the Premier Unbelievable radio show. Some of you here may have come across that. Premier Unbelievable. It was a radio show and a podcast run for some years by my friend Justin Briley. Very big on online, that show was. And they would bring together Christians and non-Christians, or sometimes actually 2 non-Christians, for amazing conversations about faith and so on. And on one occasion, a few years ago, they brought together, Justin moderated a conversation between, on the gentleman on the right-hand side in that slide is the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson, internet celebrity, very, very, very famous. His videos are watched by millions, if not billions of people. And he is very famously vague on whether he believes in God. He tries to duck that question a lot of the time. And then on the left, the woman on the left of the frame, that is Susan Blackmore. And she is a British psychologist. She's a broadcaster, brilliant woman, but she's atheist. But interestingly, she would say, I think Susan would say, It's not that she doesn't believe in God, well, she doesn't believe in God, but she doesn't care about the God question. She can literally see no point in God, so she's just not interested. Well, they had this conversation. Justin moderated this conversation between Jordan and Susan. And partway through that conversation, Susan said something really intriguing. She said, in recent years, I've been in the habit of waking up in the morning, even if it's raining in January in England, and looking out the window and saying, wow. And it's a feeling of gratitude. Not gratitude towards God or anybody or anything, just free, floating gratitude. She later, a minute or so later, she expands on this idea. And she said, this morning, for example, I looked out and it was so green. We've had frost and it's been white the last few days, but it was green this morning. And I felt gratitude to the universe, if you like. It's not really God, because it's not a creator. It's not anything you can pray to, though. Now, there's an obvious question here. Some of you looking at this are probably going, hang on a moment. There's a big question behind that. And Jordan, bless him, asked the question. So he said, so why feel gratitude towards it then? What an amazing spiritual question for a man who has no religious faith of his own. What an amazing question. And of course, you're probably all sitting there on the edge of your seat now going, well, what does Susan say? I mean, she's a brilliant woman. I think she's got 2, if not 3 PhDs. She is incredibly smart. There is probably going to be some really amazing answer to Jordan's question. Are you ready? Here comes what Susan said in return. She said, I don't know. I don't know. And she really struggled to answer the question of why feel gratitude to a godless universe. And I think what she was struggling with, and if you ever get the chance, do look up this dialogue. It's absolutely fascinating. You can find it on YouTube. And I think you can see what she's struggling with is gratitude is linked to wonder. Those two things go quite closely together. And if you want to live in a universe where science can explain everything, where you utterly deny the supernatural, where everything that exists are merely atoms and particles, gratitude doesn't really fit in. It doesn't really fit into that world. But nevertheless, when Susan flings open the window and looks out at the beauty of the world, her natural instinctive reaction is to say, wow, and feel grateful. In fact, as somebody once remarked, the greatest problem for many people is not they have nothing to be thankful for, but they have no one to be thankful to. So, how does this little conversation between Jordan and Susan about gratitude, how does it help us when it comes to evangelism, especially to the apathetic? Well, let's dig in a bit more by borrowing an illustration from C.S. Lewis. In fact, I actually want to borrow C.S. Lewis's Garden Shed. This is not, I have to give you a disclaimer, this is not really C.S. Lewis's Garden Shed. That's probably rotted away into sawdust 60, 70 years on from his death. But it's a garden shed. And C.S. Lewis, in an essay he wrote in the 1940s, I think, used an illustration about a shed. He said, I want you to imagine that you're standing in a shed, a garden shed, and outside it's a bright sunny day, but inside the shed door is shut and there are no windows, so you're there in the dark. But there's a little crack in the door of the shed. And Lewis said, I want you to imagine that through that crack in that door is a sunbeam coming down into the darkness of the shed. And now, Lewis says in his essay, we can do 2 things when it comes to that sunbeam in the shed. The first thing you could do is you could look at it and you could admire it. You could just be struck by how beautiful it is, the way the beam comes through the darkness, the way that the dust particles dance in light. It's very pretty. Maybe if you were a poet, you might write a little poem about sunbeams, or if you're an artist, you might be inspired to go and paint a beautiful picture by that beautiful little beam just coming through the darkness. You could look at the beam. Or, said Lewis, you could step into the beam and look along it. And if you did that, if you lined your eye up with the beam, you'd of course see up the beam, you'd see through the crack in the door, and you'd see millions of miles away the sun shining up there in the sky, the source of the beam of light in the first place. And Lewis wrote this essay called Meditation in a Tool Shed, in which he contrasts the difference between looking at something, looking at an experience, and looking, as it were, along an experience. And now, How does this apply to Susan Blackmore and gratitude? Well, think about this for a moment. Susan already had two choices in that conversation with Jordan there. Her first choice was to just look at her experience. She could look at the experience of gratitude and say, it's amazing. I'm feeling gratitude. Gratitude is wonderful. Gratitude is lovely. The more gratitude, the better. Isn't gratitude a nice thing? And that's okay, as far as it goes. It doesn't go very far. Or what would have happened if you could have persuaded Susan to, as it were, look along the experience of gratitude? If gratitude is, as it were, a beam of light piercing into the darkness of our everyday existence, where does that beam of light come from? What might you discover if you looked along the experience of gratitude to its source? If the sun lies at the end of the sunbeam in Lewis's story, what's the source that lies at the end of something like the experience of gratitude? And this is where the wandering question comes to help us. The wandering question, as we saw in the last talk, you're looking to take something that your friends already care about and get them thinking about the source of it, whether that's gratitude or wonder or music or justice, or there are hundreds of things, actually, everyday experiences, because no matter what your friends say they believe about spirituality and religion, they can say, like my friend John, I don't care about God. But nevertheless, our friends, our family, and neighbours, they do care deeply about things like beauty, joy, meaning, gratitude, human rights, love, consciousness, free will, happiness. The list goes on and on and on. And what those things all have in common is they don't really fit very well into a godless world. Let me give you two examples of how you can use a wandering question. We saw gratitude. We saw justice in the previous talk. Let me give you two more examples to really give you a flavour of why I think the wandering approach is so helpful for the culture that we live in right now. And let's take a look at the whole question of love. This is a great way to ask wandering questions. So an excellent example of how you can do this comes from a friend of mine called Michael. And Michael is a university evangelist. He spends lots of his time on university campuses talking to students. And on one occasion, he told me how he was chatting with a student he'd met at the university. And on finding out that Michael was a Christian, this student immediately replied, I am not into God, is what this student said to my friend Michael. Now, having someone say to you, I'm not into God, that could, of course, close down any hope of a spiritual conversation. But my friend Michael thought, well, the front door might be shut, but I wonder if I can get into this conversation from either side. So he looked at the student and went, oh, okay, you're not into God. No, I'm not into God, said the student. Okay, said Michael, what are you into? The student thought for a moment and then replied, well, I'm into love. I'm into love, was what he replied. What a wonderful answer. And Michael looked at him and said, oh, that's great, you're into love. Yeah, I'm into love, with the student. Okay, Michael said, what do you think love is? What is love? You're into it. What would you say love is? And it was really interesting. He said, the student thought for a moment and said, oh, do you know, I don't think I've thought about that question. That's a really good question. How would we define love? And then Michael said, okay, you're obviously, I guess, an atheist because you're not into God. And the student went, yeah, I think so. So Michael said, well, okay, let's try. What about if we try to figure out a totally material definition of love? What if we said love is a chemical reaction that has evolved in our brains? Right, it's the chemistry in our brains has evolved to trick us into forming attachments with people, usually of the opposite sex, in order that we might mate and reproduce and pass on our DNA to the next generation. How is that as a definition of love? And apparently the student looked at him and went, oh, that's, okay, yeah, that's interesting. Well, it turned out that standing next to the student was his girlfriend, who at this point said, what do you mean you think it's interesting? Is that what you think love is? When you told me you love me, is that what you mean? And apparently the student then went, oh, gosh, no, that's a terrible definition. No, you're right, that doesn't work at all. And then Michael was able to say, interesting. Have you ever wondered why you don't find that answer satisfying? Have you ever wondered why you are into love and why love means much more than just chemicals if, we live in a godless universe? After all, if there is a God behind the universe, maybe that might explain love a little bit better. Have you ever wondered what it might mean if there were a God who'd created us with built into us, designed that we might love one another and love him? Maybe that offers a better definition of love than the idea that it's just a few genes jostling about with one eye on the survival of the species. And Michael told me that opened up this amazing conversation at that point, starting, as I say, from love and just asking a wandering question with, in this case, a slightly cheeky grin at the same time. So that's one example of how you might use love. So we looked at human rights and shown how you could do it that way. We've seen how love is another way you could do it. Let me give you one more example of a wandering question. And I want to do something quite different this time, because obviously we just talked about, some matter and molecules and chemistry. And some of you on this call might be sciencey. Others of you might be a bit more arty and have friends who are a bit more arty. So in which case, what about the whole question of stories? This is another great place to ask wandering questions. Why is it, I wonder? I like to ask my friends who love movies and stories, have you ever wondered why it is that human beings love stories, especially stories about good and evil? In fact, a strong contender, I think, for the most famous 4 words in the English language, and there's probably the equivalent in your own language for non-English speakers on this call, will be the words once upon a time. It's interesting, whether we are young or old, we love stories. Human beings absolutely love stories. The oldest artifacts that archaeologists have found will be cave paintings, stories, and you can trace that thread right down to the most modern multiplex cinema. We are natural storytellers. But some stories, I point out to my friends, some stories are here today, gone tomorrow. But other stories become classics. They sell millions of copies. They are retold generation after generation. And I'm intrigued by the fact that the greatest stories, the ones that last the longest, seem to have a common thread. That they seem to be all about good and evil. I mean, many examples, but just to give you just a few, whether it's Katniss bringing down the establishment in the Hunger Games, massive movie and book franchise, whether it's the fight against the evil empire in Star Wars, whether it's Harry Potter versus Voldemort, or whether it's the defeat of Sauron in Lord of the Rings, good over evil, stories about good over evil abound. They are everywhere. But I like to ask my friends who love stories, have you ever wondered, why do we love stories like these ones? Why are we drawn to those stories? Because the problem is, if we live in a godless universe where, as we just talked about, all that matters is survival and reproduction, well, the only truthful story in that kind of godless universe might be a story like, I don't know, the very hungry self-replicating molecule, which might be scientifically accurate, but I suspect that story would lack something in the plot department. But it gets trickier, I say to my friends, because if we live in a godless universe, not merely are stories a bit pointless, they're also a bunch of old lies, quite frankly. Because if we live in a godless universe, firstly, words like good and evil are meaningless. What do words like good and evil mean if there are only particles floating around? But even more profoundly, if we live in a godless universe, an atheist universe, then good doesn't win. Good doesn't win. Quite frankly, good gets its backside kicked. If we live in an atheist universe, a godless universe, chaos wins. Death has the last word, and good, whatever it means, just gets utterly, utterly defeated. Because if there is no God, suffering and death are the final word. And the story of everybody in the entire universe's story is the same. Born, suffered, and died. I'd like to ask my friends, have you ever wondered if the reason we are drawn to these classic stories is because we know deep down that the theme of good triumphing over evil is really true? Even our godless friends know deep down in their very bones, they're drawn to that storyline because it's the true one. Certainly a very profoundly Christian storyline, isn't it? In fact, the Christian storyline is reflecting deliberately at times, actually, in many great stories. J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author, she said the Harry Potter stories were influenced by the Christian faith of her youth, whilst, of course, J.R.R. Tolkien, author of Lord of the Rings, comes right out and in a letter to a friend, was very clear what he was doing. He said The Lord of the Rings is, of course, a fundamentally religious and Catholic work, unconsciously so at first, but consciously in the revision. And I say to my friends, look, if Christianity is the true story of how a good God created a good world for human beings, of how we were corrupted by greed and power, and how God stepped into creation to rescue us at the cost of his own life, it should not surprise us at all that the stories we love the most are those that in some way reflect the one true story. Well, I think the reason that we've looked at 3 wandering questions this afternoon, one in the previous talk, 2 in this talk. We've looked at justice, we've looked at love, we've looked at stories. And the reason that wandering questions work so well is I think you're starting from where your friends already are. Rather than sit there and think, how can I pressurize my non-Christian friend into accepting some Christian truths? Or worse, rather than sitting there all depressed because your friends and your colleagues don't seem to show the slightest interest in spiritual things, with a wandering question, you are starting from where they already are. A good friend of mine, a guy called Andy Kind. Andy is a very gifted comedian and a Christian now, but he wasn't a Christian in his 20s. And he wrote a book a few years ago called Hidden in Plain Sight, where he explores how he came to faith in Christ. And he came through wandering questions. Let me read you a little paragraph from his testimony. He said, in my early 20s, I didn't really know what I thought of the big story that the universe is telling. There seemed to be an infinite number of religions, philosophies, and conspiracy theories which sought to account for how and why the universe is as it is. Well, I wasn't sure which of those big stories out there was the real deal. But I did know something about my little story. I knew that I believed in love. Not just love, but unconditional love. I wanted to be loved without fear of rejection. I wanted to be loved for who I was, not based on what I did. I believed in justice. I believed in purpose. I believed in freedom. I believed in beauty. And I believed that death felt unnatural to observe, no matter how many times I observed it. And for Andy, it was as friends, as Christian friends, helped him begin to wonder about those things that he already cared about, that he began to realize that it was the big story of Christianity that made the best sense of his own personal little story. And that is what wandering questions do so powerfully. So just to remind us, with a wandering question, you're looking for, listening for, praying for an opportunity to pick up on something that your friend already cares about. Then you want to take an interest in it. Ask good questions. Show that you care about the thing that they care about and listen to them as they talk. And then you're prayerfully looking for an opportunity to ask a wandering question, looking for that way to just gently introduce into the conversation the idea that just maybe there's a better explanation for the thing that they care about, and maybe that's the Christian story. And then fourthly, you're looking to show how Christianity makes best sense of it. You see, as C.S. Lewis, whose shed we briefly borrowed earlier, C.S. Lewis once wrote something interesting. He wrote many things that are interesting, but he wrote something on this. And Lewis, by the way, if you know anything about C.S. Lewis, he himself was another person who came to faith through wandering questions. Lewis wrote this on one occasion. He said, I believe in Christianity in the same way as I believe the sun has risen. Not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. In other words, Lewis was saying, the Christian faith sheds light on everything in life. But if that's the case, you can run this in reverse too, because you can look for those places that the Christian faith is shedding light into our friends' lives through things they haven't even figured out yet. Gratitude, beauty, meaning, justice, stories, the list goes on. And then you're saying, hey, look at that bit of light that's coming in through the shed door there. Where do you think that it points? And with practice, you can learn to ask wandering questions out loud and use them all over the place as you seek to discover the things that really matter to your friends and colleagues and connect them to the gospel. And I mentioned earlier, by the way, we wrote this book, Have You Ever Wondered? That came out earlier in the year. That does that really, really well. I've been amazed at the stories of people getting that into the hands of non-Christian friends. What I would encourage you to do don't just read it and go, hey, this is a lovely Christian book, isn't it great? I want you to look at that book and then go, this is really exciting. I can think of a non-Christian friend who I can buy a copy for. They are super cheap to get hold of online from the publisher, but have a look yourself first and then share the love with a non-Christian friend. We have seen amazing stories happen over the last 6 months as that book has got into the hands of people with no spiritual interest, and it has started conversations.